Welcome back to Mental Health Matters. We got a really exciting show today, again on PTSD, a really fascinating topic with an incredible guest. I can't believe he's on today, Gary Kaplen. My name is Dr. Scott Terry, and I am a marriage and family therapist, a counselor, and I am the executive and clinical director of the Ardent Counseling Center, the Ardent Community Wellness Center, and a couple different other organizations. So today, we're going to look at PTSD from a number of different angles and see why it's so important and some different avenues that we can explore with this topic. As always, my co-host, Rob Hubler.
Hey, Rob. Good morning. Or afternoon, whichever time you're listening to this.
All right. And Rob, introduce our guest.
Well, Gary Kaplen is in New York right now, and I'd like him to introduce himself.
He's an MD, PhD. Go ahead, Gary.
Okay.
Yes, hi, I'm Gary Kaplen. I'm talking to you here from Long Island, where it's a little rainy and cool this morning. I'm at ProHealth, which is a large multi-specialty group, and I'm a neurologist here, and I'm also an associate professor of neurology at the New Medical School at Hofstra University.
Wow. Very impressive.
Affiliated with North Shore and LIJ Health System.
Where are you from originally, Gary?
I'm sorry, so my background is basically, I was in Ithaca, New York at Cornell as an undergraduate, majoring in biology and neurobiology and behavior concentration, and then I went out to Washington University in St. Louis and got my PhD in neuroscience. And then I went for my MD degree and then specialized in neurology.
Okay.
All right.
Great. And so tell us why you're so interested in this topic and why we're talking about it today.
I think post-traumatic stress is really something that affects so many more people other than those who've had even the major psychological traumas. And certainly we hear about it most in people who are victims of horrible abuse, either domestic abuse or people who are in war-torn areas or subject to great catastrophic and tragic events in their lives. But I think in a milder form it affects so many people. It's a kind of emotional scar, and that many people carry with them. So that it's really a topic that's, I think, relevant to most any of your listeners.
I think that's a fascinating point. As a systemic therapist, part of my perspective is that we need to look at not just primary trauma, but essentially also secondary trauma and the systemic ramifications. The way that I think about it is, it's not just, let's say, a veteran who's coming back from a war-torn area, but also that veteran comes back and then he affects his partner or her partner, and then essentially almost like a disease, but in a different kind of a way. And it migrates out from the primary person who's having issues and then affects everybody else in their environment, family, friends, kids, and then they affect other people and then get feedback from the world around them, which also then becomes more stressed. And you could almost think about like concentric circles around a person and around an issue. Almost like you would think of the reason you would vaccinate somebody to, circles and circles and circles around that person to become protected or not protected.
That's fascinating. I think it's a very good analogy between, traditional infectious diseases and people who have problems in the psychological realm that so significantly affect the other people with whom they deal on a daily basis, and particularly those that are closely related to in their family and their close circle of friends.
Absolutely. And, you could really think about it in those kind of ways, just like PTSD is not often a single condition from what I see. It's not a trauma happens and then boom, you now have this issue. There's predecessors that come along. How resilient you are. Did you have a really good childhood? Did you have a really crappy childhood? Did have bad things happen to you in the past, minor traumas or bigger traumas that set you up for a particular event to happen? And then afterwards, how are you dealing with it? What's your reference to what's happened? And is there another way to create a new reference, a new way to be in relationship to what was?
Exactly. I think that's really the case. It's a function of the resilience of your own nervous system, and that's associated with different factors. Of course, there's the intellectual side of it, the understanding of what is happening to you and how it may affect you, and sort of rationalizing through what life events have occurred and how to make sense of them, and that can bring you to a certain point in terms of dealing with post-traumatic stress. And I think that's why cognitive and behavioral therapies have their place. But then there's also physiologically, how does your system respond, and how can you develop a nervous system that is able to take that stress and not incorporate it and make it have such a negative impact on your physiology and your psychology.
Absolutely. And then you're in a relationship essentially to your body. So if your body is able to address that stress, your nervous system doesn't become overwhelmed or is able to adapt to the stressor that's happened, however bad it is, then you're in a much better position to move away from what's happened. Or if you're stuck in it now, to use some tools. We talk about a number of different avenues to address the physiology, which I'd like you to get into, that might be useful to, if you're under stress and have had, let's say, a traumatic event. How do you move away from that? How do you recondition your body so you can start a more positive feedback loop so that you could change all these interactions within yourself and those around you?
Right. Yes, I think that's rather important. In particular, I think that's where the PM technique is so useful, because it can actually work for you before you encounter the stress, so that encountering the stress isn't as momentous a situation and having such a negative effect. I think that the old analogy of stress being a line on a rock versus a line on the water versus a line on the air in terms of its impact on the nervous system really holds true when you consider the whole field of post-traumatic stress. So that if you're conditioning your nervous system daily with daily TM practice as the prime example.
That's transcendental meditation, for those of you that don't know.
Yes, I think that is a good basis. And then, wherever you are in terms of the resilience of your own nervous system, at the time then that you encounter the stress, the new stress, whatever it is, an illness, a death in the family, some violent act, then, of course, depending on the resilience of your nervous system at that point, some or more or less stress might be accumulated, but then the other techniques and therapies, can be useful as well at that point. But at least to have the basis of a technique, in this case we're talking about the transcendental transcendental meditation technique where you can sit down and really experience that integrated functioning of the nervous system twice a day. That's going to go a long way to helping culture that resilience, and then also helping deal with the stress as it comes in. So I think, the way I look at it, I was thinking about it earlier this morning, and I said it's really, in a way, it's kind of magical, but it's kind of simple in a way, because basically you're sitting down and experiencing, not just intellectually, but actually physically experiencing, and experiencing on the level of the mind and on the level of the nervous system, that there is this simplest state of awareness, and that at that level, those horrible, overshadowing problems do not exist. They exist on more superficial levels. And just the realization that, oh, that's what I am. I'm really that calm, infinite, expanded, unified field, if you will, or that ground state of the mind. And that all this other stress is added on top. It's so important not only to, first to understand it intellectually, but then also to experience it, because then all of a sudden your whole frame of reference changes. It's amazing. I think that stress and the effect of stress on mental health is one of the only examples I can think of a true overshadowing illness that can change in almost an instant in terms of perspective. And we all know that, even just from the usual worries and cares that we accumulate in our daily activity, not that we consider them as part of a disease process, but we're worried, and then all of a sudden something happens and we're not worried about it, And that whole kind of style of physiological functioning changes. It can just change on a dime. It's so interesting the way that can occur.
Speaking of changing on a dime, let's pause for a break here. This is Mental Health Matters with Dr. Scott Terry, and we are listening to KRUU solar-powered radio in Fairfield, Iowa, 100.1 on your FM dial. Earlier, when we were talking, you mentioned you
We're
talking
about PTSD today, by the way.
Yes, right. And earlier you mentioned when we were talking specifically about PTSD in the brain. Can you pick up on that a little bit, Gary?
Yes. PTSD in the brain, it's an interesting topic, and there has been some research. And there's research on stressful conditions both in laboratory animals and in humans. And in laboratory animals, there are models of inducing psychological stress. One of them is called the learned helplessness model, which was developed as a model actually of depression, where you have a laboratory animal like a rat in a situation where it's kind of a no-win. They're not going to be happy because they can't fulfill a particular desire in the laboratory setting, and then they finally kind of give up. But if you take a look at the brain in these situations of extreme stress, the more primitive part of the brain, which is underneath the cerebral cortex, which is rather large and sits on the top of the brain, is the biggest mass in the human brain. Underneath it, there's this limbic system. It's a very old part of the brain. It's responsible for the fight or flight reaction. It's responsible for a lot of the most basic emotions, things like hunger and anger, mood changes that are associated with autonomic changes in our physiology, meaning our heart rate and our blood pressure and how much our pupils dilate and our sweating and feelings of fear and feelings of anger and the like. So these structures, which include the hippocampus, which is the gateway to memory in the brain, a very old part of the cortex, and parts of the thalamus deep in the brain, and parts of an old part of the cortex called the cingulate gyrus, and an older part of the brain called the amygdala. All these all these structures with Latin names, they all form a type of circuit deep within the brain, and they're all affected to some extent in post-traumatic stress particularly when the stress has been going on for a while, we see that the hippocampus, that gateway of memory, is reduced in size in many patients with PTSD because of the negative effects of the stress hormone, particularly cortisol, which is the type of steroid medication that our bodies make, have an effect of decreasing the nerve cells in that area. And so the hippocampus gets smaller, and so that can affect memory itself. Then the neighboring structure, the amygdala, that's abnormally activated in post-traumatic stress. And so it infuses memories typically with some emotional coloring. And so its excessive activity can trigger anger and rage reactions. We know this, both from non-humans and in humans. So the amygdala is affected. And then the whole effect of this abnormal limbic system activity is eventually going to be on the prefrontal cortex, which is that frontal part of the brain, the big part of the cortex that's involved in our executive decision-making and planning, the seat of judgment and planning, and it's thought in general to counterbalance that impulsive activity that comes from the limbic system and particularly the amygdala. But its activity is somewhat reduced in PTSD, and so there's this imbalance, and the result obviously is not good in terms of our psychological functioning.
And so what you have is this cascading effect, and as we would say, almost like a negative feedback loop system, which runs from one part of the brain to the other, where at some point it becomes literally hard for you to think, to remember, to your brain changes. And that's how come when we keep talking about various tools, like you mentioned the transcendental meditation technique, and we don't want to be like, that's the answer, the only answer, we're just a promoter of this technique. But it is an incredibly useful tool, and that's how come you keep bringing it up as a way to address the actual structures in the brain chemistry of what's going on.
Exactly, yes. When you're talking about things that can change activity in the brain, most of the time we're talking about, in the past, medications, which do have an effect on neurotransmitter function. These are the chemicals that are throughout the brain. And so you can affect different structures preferentially, more or less, by changing levels of some of the neurochemicals like dopamine and serotonin and norepinephrine. And in fact, in some more severe psychiatric conditions, these are medications that affect these are rather helpful. But separately from affecting the brain biochemically, we don't go around in general affecting the brain structurally, surgically. I mean, we used to in the 40s and 50s with frontal lobotomies and like this, but it's obviously a very crude way to go. We can affect the functioning of the brain electrically with electroconvulsive therapy, which is still used in severe cases of depression, and can have certainly an effect when other things don't. But then we've found over the last 20, 30, 40 years that mental techniques can certainly affect brain physiology and brain biochemistry. And even in patients who receive cognitive or behavioral therapy for depression, sure enough, activity in parts of the brain that were negatively affected in depression also change, for the better. So we know that everything we do has some effect on brain physiology because our brain is the organ that's experiencing, when our mind experiences, our brain is the area that's active and changing. So, it's one of the reasons why it's so exciting, talking about the TM technique in particular, because of that integrated effect that it can have on the brain.
So what else do you propose to do? Do you suggest for people that might feel that they or somebody that they love have this. By the way, you're listening to KRUU FM 100.1. And you could email us at mentalhealthmatters@kruufm.com. We're talking with the really powerful Gary Kaplen, who is MD, PhD, neurologist, about PTSD. And you're also involved in this project about PTSD in Africa as well, I hear.
Yes. I'm very excited about what David Shapiro and others have been doing to try to bring the TM technique there, particularly for this population, because it's easy to teach, and you don't have to sort of change the rest of the lifestyle, which is, I'm sure, rather chaotic in those war-torn areas in Africa. But, very profound effects very quickly. So I think, separate from that extreme situation, for those people who are experiencing post-traumatic stress, here in the United States, for any of a number of reasons, including family situations and the like, obviously the first and most important thing is to make sure that they've consulted with a mental health professional so that they can sort of understand the breadth and depth of the problem. And then to incorporate, any technique that's not going to have significant side effects that can positively impact the situation and improve resilience of the nervous system. So we mentioned the TM technique, a very good daily routine where someone is getting enough sleep and concentrating that sleep at night is very important. A healthful and nourishing diet, obviously, is going to have an important impact. And then people forget sometimes about the amount of physical exercise that they need. Yeah. And we're finding this in neurology, and I know also in psychiatry, how important it is that people get a moderate physical exercise, to the extent that they can tolerate it. So important, on a daily basis. And then, of course, getting outdoors and getting some good sun exposure, very important, particularly in the winter months. We know about seasonal affective disorder, and we know about the effect of sunlight and how positive that effect can be. We forget about these things, in the modern world where we can spend all of our days and nights indoors with no light or some artificial light. So that's also important.
I love how you're describing going through the basics. We go through this a lot: exercise, diet, meditation, sleep, integrating with your environment. There are a lot of the physiological changes that every one of us can make to improve the quality of our lives and the lives of those around us. These are not just, words, but this is, habits that we need to really shift for us to not just be alive, but to be fully alive. And then apart from shifting the neurochemistry, we could get more into my realm of psychotherapies. And there are many different kinds of techniques to be utilized, depending on what works best for somebody, from exposure therapy to hypnosis, EMDR. I'm a trauma specialist, and I use a number of different techniques myself, and have worked with a number of people who specifically have been traumatized in some very severe ways. And this sort of combination of looking at what we can do, how we can take control over our bodies and our brains, so we can take control over what's going on in our minds and our emotions, really gives us the power and strength to then make the other alterations of what else we can do. But I want to hear from you what else you see as a full package. So you see some of the basics, right? Exercise, meditation, diet, sleep, integrating with the environment, etc. But what else do you recommend to people from your position?
Right. At times, depending on what the issues are, medication may play a role. But also, I think we also sometimes forget in this day and age how important productive activity is during the day. Feeling like you're making a difference, and sometimes that involves activity that really gets you involved more than you might normally be involved at sort of a routine job in a goal-directed activity, particularly if it's the activity that primarily and substantially is benefiting, other people in a philanthropic way, or just giving of yourself. That type of charitable or goal-directed activity with, obvious and tangible results. Feeling like you're part of something that's going to help someone else, taking the focus off of you. I think that's really important as well.
Well, as listeners will know, one of my favorite people ever is a guy called Viktor Frankl, who in the concentration camps was a famous psychiatrist who, even in the worst PTSD situation you could ever imagine, looked at purpose of life and being able to find love and light and possibility, even in the worst experiences that one could have in this existence. And finding that purpose today is so healing. And so many, for instance, veterans I see, part of their real healing is finding that purpose. Yes, it's changing the brain chemistry through the things we talk about. And yes, it's looking at different therapeutic aspects. But it's essential to come back to basics of who am I? Why am I here? How can I really have an impact, whatever my circumstances? No matter where I'm at, no matter what's happened to me, I can be powerful and create a message and make a difference in the lives of others. I've seen people with limbs no longer there and their faces permanently disfigured, and being able to make huge amount of impact in others and saying that they could be positive and strong, and they could take that experience that's happened to them to make a difference in the lives of others.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's so important, and we tend to forget it. It's just, I guess, society goes in phases, swings back and forth, but I think more and more people are realizing this, again, something that we knew from a long time ago, that this type of purpose-driven, life-supporting activity is important, is very important.
It's important to have meaning behind everything, including our life. But right now, you're listening to Mental Health Matters with Dr. Scott Terry. This is KRUU FM 100.1 on the radio dial, and we're almost out of time.
And is there anything else you'd like to close with?
Well, just to reiterate, I think it's important to understand that post-traumatic stress disorder is not a terminal illness, does not have to be, even though in some tragic cases it has been in the past. People have to, who are experiencing this either mildly or severely, have to realize that this is eminently treatable. And this is something that can be recovered from. Our memories are always there.
Thank you. That's a great message to go out on. And we look forward to talking to you again in the future. Bye, everyone. Have a great day. Hey.